Hello everyone, I'm really glad you're here. Tonight, I want to help you let go of the day and ease into rest. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, and it means a lot to be part of your nightly routine. So if you haven't already, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It truly helps. Now, settle in, close your eyes, and let's begin. The first story. Urban exploration accident in a factory. I used to be obsessed with urban exploration. It wasn't just a hobby, it was a passion. The thrill of sneaking into forgotten structures, the eeriness of navigating abandoned halls, and the satisfaction of capturing it all with my camera kept me constantly on the lookout for new places to discover. I had a few online friends who shared this passion, and together we often shared locations and stories about our adventures. One day, I stumbled upon a post that described a massive, decaying factory complex not far from where I lived. From the pictures and the write-up, it looked like an urban explorer's dream. I was shocked I hadn't heard of it before. According to the post, it was lightly secured but manageable if you went at night. Tempted by the prospect of untouched territory, I packed my gear and made plans to visit that very weekend. That Saturday night, under a heavy grey sky, I loaded my camera, flashlight, gloves and a few essentials into my bag and set off. The drive took just under an hour, and as I approached, the silhouette of the factory rose like some long-forgotten monolith. I parked behind a dense patch of overgrowth to avoid detection and followed a worn trail through a clearing to get closer. The factory still had some exterior lighting, and I could see the faint movement of security guards making rounds along a dirt track that looped the perimeter. Still, it didn't appear heavily guarded. The post had been right. Security was present, but not aggressively so. I found a metal staircase on the side of the building, rusted and partially hidden behind vines. Strangely, it hadn't been sealed off. With cautious excitement, I climbed the steps toward the roof, knowing it was supposed to be the best point of entry. From the rooftop, the view was both haunting and beautiful. The factory grounds stretched out in every direction, overgrown and broken, but still pulsing with the quiet dignity of forgotten history. The night air was cold, sharp with winter's touch, and I could hear the distant flapping of bats overhead. I spent the first 20 minutes snapping photos of the city skyline and the skeletal remains of the factory itself. I then descended through an open hatch and began exploring the upper levels. With my flashlight cutting narrow beams through the thick darkness, I wandered through graffiti-covered corridors and rooms filled with discarded machinery, broken furniture, and years of decay. Some floors were dangerously unstable, with gaps and makeshift planks laid across collapsed sections. It was a perfect mix of danger and wonder, exactly the kind of place I lived to explore. Eventually, I decided to venture deeper. I wanted to reach the basement, where the most untouched relics usually lingered, the heart of the place. As I made my way down, I was mesmerized by a cluster of bats fluttering above, snapping a few shaky pictures. I was checking one of the images on my phone when it happened. I didn't see the gaping hole in the floor ahead. One moment I was walking, and the next I was falling into darkness. The air washed past me in a sickening blur before I crashed down hard. Pain exploded in my back and legs. My breath fled my lungs, and I lay there, dazed and shocked, unable to move for what felt like minutes. Eventually, I stirred and reached for my flashlight, which had flown several feet away. As I crawled toward it, sharp pain lanced through my palms. I gasped, realizing I was surrounded by broken glass. It looked like someone had once thrown bottles down here, shattering them across the floor. I was forced to carefully inch my way over the jagged shards, trembling with every move. My flashlight's beam finally flickered back to life, casting long shadows across what looked like an old sub-basement. I realized, with growing horror, that I had landed on a narrow ledge. Just a few feet to my left, the ground dropped off again into an even deeper pit, likely the true basement. If I had landed differently, I might have plummeted even farther, onto unforgiving concrete or rusted debris. That knowledge alone chilled me more than the cold air around me. Panic started to creep in as I surveyed my surroundings. The drop I'd just taken left me trapped in what looked like a fractured part of the structure, boxed in on all sides. I couldn't see any clear way out. The walls around me were cracked and mouldy, and the only opening was the jagged hole I'd fallen through, far above and inaccessible. I considered yelling, but I was worried. What if the only people who heard me were security? I didn't want to be charged with trespassing, fined, or worse. My back throbbed, and I could barely stand without wobbling. In desperation, I turned off my flashlight to conserve its precious battery and sat alone in the dark, heart pounding, wondering how long it would take before someone found me. The hours stretched on. I screamed into the void a few times, but no answer came. My phone had no signal. The screen was cracked from the fall. There was no help coming. Time lost all meaning. I knew I had been trapped for at least 12 hours, maybe more. My phone's cracked screen still told the time, and I kept checking it, counting each painful minute. I was hungry, thirsty, aching and terrified. The thought of dying alone in a forgotten factory haunted me. What if no one ever found me? What if my skeleton was discovered years later, tucked away in this crevice like an echo of some cautionary tale? The fear was overwhelming. I tried not to cry, but at times it broke through. That kind of isolation, that kind of fear, it changes you. The darkness didn't just press against my skin, it got into my mind, my thoughts, every corner of my body. It was cold, damp, and still as the grave. I tried everything I could think of, but there was no way up. No handholds, no escape. Then, like the answer to a whispered prayer, I heard footsteps. Echoing faintly from somewhere above, they reverberated across the walls like a lifeline. I froze, listening intently. When they drew closer, I shouted. I screamed with all the strength my lungs could muster, my voice ragged and desperate. For a moment, I thought it was a hallucination. Then a voice called back. I shouted again, and soon 2 figures appeared above, peering down with concern. They were fellow urban explorers, more experienced than me, with gear and rope and sturdy boots. They wasted no time. One stayed up top, while the other climbed down to me, securing himself and extending a hand. I could have wept from relief. It was difficult, painful, but together we made it out. Back on the ground level, they asked if I was okay. I told them I thought I could walk, and after testing my footing, I realized I could. I was sore, but not broken. I thanked them again and again, grateful beyond words. One of them even asked for my number, and I gave it without hesitation, still riding the high of sheer gratitude and survival. I hobbled back to my car and drove home slowly. When I finally made it back, it was nearly midnight on Sunday. I had been trapped in that factory for almost a full day. That experience shook something loose inside me. I never went urban exploring again. Those 24 hours changed how I saw risk, how I understood fear, and how little it takes to be utterly, dangerously alone in the world. Since that day, I've tried to warn others. Be careful when you explore. Bring people, bring ropes, bring safety gear. Respect the danger. Because you might not get lucky like I did. You might fall and not get found. You might not have a signal. You might not have a second chance. There are places in this world that do not care if you live or die. And sometimes the worst thing isn't what you find in the dark. It's being left there, unseen and unheard, with nothing but the echo of your own breathing and the weight of your regrets. That night, I met the edge of what I could handle, and though I came back, I left something behind in that factory. A part of me that learnt the price of not paying attention. Second story. A year ago, when I was 15, I went on a school trip to San Francisco. At the time, I wasn't particularly mature. I wasn't naive in a childish sense, but rather, I didn't yet understand just how strange and dangerous the world could be. That trip and a few other unsettling experiences that followed marked the beginning of a slow, uncomfortable shift in how I saw reality. Growing up is often romanticized, but part of it is recognizing that not everyone you meet has good intention. I was sharing a hotel room with two other girls who were both older than me, and I didn't know them all that well. We were grouped together based on gender and availability, not friendship. Still, we got along fine, and I felt relatively safe in their company as we prepared each morning for our scheduled explorations of the city. Breakfast was served between 7 and 8 a.m. in the hotel's dining area, but there was a catch. The chaperones wouldn't wake us up. If we wanted to eat and get ready in time, we had to do it ourselves. It wasn't a problem most days, but we were teenagers and that often meant we moved slowly in the mornings. Usually we'd rush down around 7:45, only to grab food quickly before heading out with the group. But one morning we were all feeling a bit more motivated. We woke up early, determined to arrive right when breakfast opened, so we wouldn't feel rushed. The lobby was full of sleepy-eyed students, all trying to grab a decent spot at a table and get their day started on the right foot. I remember chatting with my twin brother, who was also on the trip, as we waited for the elevator to take us back to our rooms. We were already packed tight into the elevator when two men forced their way inside at the last second. They looked like they were in their early 20s, young, confident, and just a little too comfortable squeezing into the full elevator. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe they were hotel guests, maybe they just didn't want to wait for the next ride. We got off on our floor, and so did they. That was the first little red flag. Our group of students turned right down the hallway, and the men turned left. My brother and his friends eventually peeled off into their rooms, and it was just me and one of my roommates left by the time we reached our door. That's when we saw the men again. They weren't lost. They weren't trying to find their room. They were waiting for us. They were suddenly right in front of us, blocking our path and standing far too close. My heart started pounding and my mind scrambled for what to do. We both clumsily pulled out our room keys, pretending to be casual, but it was clear we were afraid. The men stepped even closer. One of them looked me up and down, not bothering to hide the way he was eyeing me. The other leaned in toward my roommate, asking her for her number in broken English. She stood taller and told him no, her voice shaking but firm. I could barely speak. I tried to come up with something, anything that might make them go away. I explained that we were underage on a school trip and that they needed to leave us alone. They didn't care. The man stared at me with a blank expression, as if weighing whether or not to listen. Just as I was about to swipe my keycard to open our door, my roommate quickly stopped me. She pushed my hand down and whispered for me to wait. At the time, I didn't understand why she didn't just let us in. But later I realized what she had already figured out. If we opened that door in front of them, they might push their way in. We'd be trapped inside with no one to help. Instead, she grabbed my wrist and we bolted down the hallway. We ran, my legs burning, and luckily we ran straight into my brother and one of his friends. We breathlessly explained what had just happened, and without missing a beat, they ran with us to the elevators. As we waited for the doors to open, I could feel the tension rising in my chest. Every second felt like an eternity, and I could sense that the men were behind us again. We jammed the elevator button repeatedly until the doors finally opened. As they began to close, we saw the men step into the hallway, walking toward us again, slowly, deliberately. We slammed the closed door button. The doors shut in their faces. We thought we had escaped, but the hotel had multiple elevators. By the time we reached the breakfast area downstairs, they were there too, standing on the opposite side of the room, their eyes locked on us. I stayed close to my brother, gripping his arm like it was the only thing keeping me grounded. My roommate clung to his friend in the same way. The men didn't approach immediately. They stood there, pretending to be guests, pretending to belong. But we knew better. We knew they were watching us. And we knew this wasn't over. We left the dining area as soon as we could and returned to our room, but now we were shaken. They knew where we were staying. They knew our floor, our hallway. Our minds spiraled into every possible worst-case scenario. We tried to calm ourselves, telling each other it was probably over now, that they wouldn't try anything else. Then, the hotel room phone rang. At first we thought maybe it was a prank, one of the boys messing with us, but when we picked up, there was no voice, just heavy breathing, then laughter. It was soft, cold, and quiet. We hung up after about 20 seconds, both of us frozen in place. That laugh was wrong. It wasn't playful or friendly. It was menacing. We called my brother and his friends and they came upstairs immediately. We told them everything, including the phone call. One of them tried to say it was just a joke, probably to help us feel better. But I didn't believe him. Not because I thought he was lying, but because I could still hear the sound of that laugh in my head. We went back downstairs and found our chaperones. This time, we told them everything. They were visibly upset, and so were we. We spoke to the hotel's front desk staff, who tried to reassure us, but said there was nothing they could do without the men's names or room numbers. They told us a group of guests matching that description had recently checked in and would likely be leaving soon. But those words didn't comfort us. They didn't erase what had happened. They didn't undo the fear. Thankfully, we never saw the men again after that day. Maybe they did leave. Maybe the hotel quietly dealt with them. We'll never know. But that experience marked a turning point for me. It made me see the world through a new lens. Not everyone means well. Some people are waiting for the right moment to do harm. You can be smart, cautious, and still find yourself in danger. I learned how quickly something innocent can turn into something terrifying, and how important it is to trust your instincts. My roommate saved us that day by following hers. If she hadn't stopped me from unlocking that door, I don't know what would have happened. I think about that day more often than I care to admit. It sits in the back of my mind like a silent warning, a reminder that awareness can be the difference between safety and catastrophe. I don't blame the hotel, I don't blame the chaperones, I don't even blame myself for not recognizing the danger sooner. But I know now that being alert, listening to that quiet inner voice, and never ignoring unease might be the most important lessons I took away from that trip. That, and the simple fact that sometimes the scariest moments happen in broad daylight, in public, in places that are supposed to be safe. Third story. My story begins with a job that seemed ordinary on the surface, yet unfolded in one of the most surreal and unsettling places I've ever worked. A psychiatric hospital in Dumfries, Scotland, known as the Crichton. The name alone might evoke grim mental images, but the truth was far more complex. The hospital grounds were vast and surprisingly beautiful, built in the 1870s with grand Victorian architecture and manicured gardens that disguised the institution's darker history. There was even a striking church standing at the centre of the property, dignified and solemn, like the keeper of long-forgotten secrets. I worked there as a night security guard, and though many imagined it to be a frightening job, I never truly felt afraid. Not at first. Fear was something I thought belonged in horror films, not in my rounds beneath a star-filled sky. My duties were routine, and the night shifts followed a slow rhythm. I'd drive around the property for an hour at a time, flashlight in hand, radio on my belt, making sure no one with ill intent was hiding among the shadows. Before I started, there had been 2 previous guards who had quit abruptly. No one told me exactly why, and I didn't ask. It never occurred to me to be scared. The grounds were still, the wind was quiet, and the buildings, though aged, stood firm and quiet in their dignity. Sure, the odd alarm would go off due to a drafty window or a moth triggering a motion sensor. Nothing unusual for an old place like this. I found peace in the stillness, in the soft crunch of frost beneath my boots, and in the eerie beauty of the night. The moonlight would fall across the rooftops, casting silver shadows over the brickwork, like nature's own security light. It was just before Christmas when the first strange thing happened. It was one of those cold, crisp nights where the stars hung low and bright in the sky and the air seemed to hum with anticipation. I was patrolling near the far end of the complex when I received an alert. An alarm had been triggered in a building called Solway House. Now, this was one of the older buildings on the property, and unlike the others, carried with it a darker, heavier energy. At present, it served as an art studio for local students and budding musicians. Nothing about the building's appearance screamed danger, but it always gave me pause. That night, as I approached, I noticed the external door had been left wide open. That explained the alarm. Easy enough. I stepped inside, shut off the alarm and started writing up the paperwork on my clipboard, ready to move on. That's when I heard the first noise. Loud banging from the upper floors. My heart jumped a little, but I shook it off. Maybe someone had stayed late and forgot to lock up. Or perhaps a window had blown open in the wind. Even though the temperature was below freezing and there wasn't a breath of wind that night, I told myself it was nothing. I made my way upstairs, flashlight cutting through the pitch black, and searched each room. Nothing. No one. Just old paintbrushes, canvases, and the lingering scent of turpentine. I stood there for a few moments, listening to the silence, before turning to head back down. Then it started again. Only this time, the noise was louder. It sounded like someone was hurling furniture across the room, like tables and chairs were being thrown violently against the walls. I froze. The sound echoed through the stairwell, chilling and out of place in a building that should have been completely empty. I climbed the stairs once more, faster this time, and checked the rooms again. Still nothing. Everything was in place, no chairs overturned, no shattered frames, nothing that could explain the sound. I started checking the windows, the toilets, the boiler room, anywhere that could produce even a hint of the chaos I just heard. There was nothing. That's when I felt it. The air around me seemed to grow heavy. A strange, static sensation prickled against my skin, as if I'd walked into a field of invisible electricity. It was like something unseen was there, watching me, not someone. Something that didn't want me there. My chest tightened with the kind of fear that logic couldn't reason away. Descending the staircase, the oppressive feeling seemed to follow me, shadowing each step like a cold breath against the back of my neck. My thoughts turned spiritual, instinctual even. I silently recited the prayer to St. Michael the Archangel, a prayer I'd only ever said when paralyzed by nightmares as a child. I'm not Catholic, but in that moment I needed something, anything, to hold on to. I reached the bottom of the stairs and the feeling vanished, as if I'd stepped out of a shadow and into the light. I stood still, trying to calm my breathing, trying to reason my way out of what I had just experienced, but no matter how I looked at it, something had changed in that building. Something unseen had made itself known. I returned to my paperwork and tried to finish quickly. That's when the banging resumed again. It was louder than ever, echoing through the entire building like the wrath of something ancient and unseen. I stood at the base of the stairs and shouted half bravely, half in frustration, "I haven't got all night for this. Do your worst. I'm leaving." And with that, I turned on my heel and walked out of Solway House. Back at the main office, I mentioned the experience to a colleague. He barely blinked. "Solway? Oh yeah, that place is haunted," he said casually. "They used to cremate bodies there, back when patients passed." I stared at him, stunned, half wondering why no one had bothered to tell me that before. So many questions circled in my mind, but he spoke about it like it was common knowledge. Like the haunting was just part of the night shift. Looking back now, I understand that some places carry weight, memories, energy, echoes of trauma or grief. Solway House was one of those places. I had always imagined ghosts as some Hollywood horror trope, exaggerated and entertaining, but this was different. This was silent tension, invisible eyes, and unexplained noises that seemed to respond to my very presence. And still, I finished my shift. I returned to that building again on future nights, each time with a little more caution, a little more respect. Nothing quite like that ever happened again, but the memory remained, etched into my spine like the echo of something that had brushed too close. There's something oddly elegant about being haunted by a place, not in the sense of jump scares or flying objects, but in the way your thoughts circle back to it, again and again. Even now, I sometimes catch myself thinking about that building, the quiet, the cold, the way the moonlight touched its windows like a spotlight on an old stage. I've worked other jobs since then, in cities full of noise and modernity, but nothing has ever felt quite like that night. Solway House was old, forgotten and beautifully eerie, and I truly believe it still waits for someone else to walk its halls at midnight, someone else to feel its presence. Maybe that building wasn't just haunted by the dead. Maybe it was waiting for the living to come listen. Fourth story. About a year ago, a few close friends and I set out on what we thought would be just another thrilling night of urban exploration. We had all dabbled in it before, wandering through the decaying remnants of old Chicago buildings, always chasing the quiet adrenaline of history's forgotten corners. That night, we chose Edgewater Hospital, an infamous abandoned facility that had gained a sort of mythic status among local explorers. Not only had Hillary Clinton been born there, but it had also witnessed countless untold stories since its closure. We weren't exactly professionals, but we knew what we were doing. We had headlamps, masks, gloves, and first aid kits. We understood the risks of asbestos exposure and structural instability. Yet, even with all of our preparation, nothing could have prepared us for what happened once we stepped inside. The only entrance we could find was through a rusted overhead pipe that stretched between buildings. We took turns shimmying across like nervous acrobats. One of us lost a hat to the barbed wire, but nobody looked back. We were too eager, too full of reckless curiosity. We climbed through a broken window where one of my friends sliced his arm on the jagged glass. We paused in a dusty, crumbling room to clean and bandage the cut. That was always part of our ritual, patching each other up and pressing on. As we stood there, I pulled my mask down and took a long, cautious breath. Even through the filter, I could smell the mildew, the rot, the chemicals baked into the air. This place was long dead, but it didn't feel empty. Not really. We began our exploration in what appeared to be the patient wing. The hallways were narrow, low-ceilinged, and lined with decay. The tiles beneath our boots cracked and crunched as we stepped through the darkness. We used our light sparingly, trying to preserve the batteries and heighten the mood. Graffiti littered the walls, strange symbols, curse words, crude jokes, and ominous warnings. Don't go down. They never left. You'll hear it before you see it. We laughed at first. That's how it always starts. Joking, pretending not to care, as if irreverence can keep fear at bay. But as we passed an old nurse's station, something shifted. Dusty medical files were scattered everywhere. Some bore a single word, deceased. Others listed conditions, medications, and dates that blurred into smudges. A few drawers remained open, as if someone had rummaged through in haste. As we moved deeper into the hallway, we noticed something strange. The curtains. Some rooms still had them, suspended and drawn. Others had fallen, shredded or slumped on the ground. One curtain, we all agreed, fluttered slightly as if caught by a breeze. But there was no breeze. Every window was sealed or shattered, and the air was stagnant. Still, we pushed forward, driven by excitement and an edge of unease that none of us were willing to admit out loud. Eventually we came to a stairwell. It was wide, cracked, and led downward into blackness. Against our better judgment, we decided to descend. It was the basement level, or so we thought. We didn't know it yet, but we were heading straight for the morgue. The smell hit us first, thick and foul, like rot mixed with metal and time. Our masks couldn't fully shield us from it. Every step echoed down the corridor like footsteps behind us. The room opened up into a large, dark space that felt colder than the rest of the building. Our lights flicked across the walls, revealing rusted cabinets, cracked tiles, and deep sinks stained with something too dark to be rust. On the far side of the room, a row of body drawers stood like silent sentinels, their handles corroded and half sealed by time. The middle of the room held what looked like an old autopsy table, and against one wall was a large tub with an overhanging faucet. We barely spoke. None of us wanted to be the first to say what we were thinking. I started feeling it again, that creeping sense of wrongness in the pit of my stomach. I tried to brush it off, focusing instead on photographing the cabinets and making notes about what we saw. Then, without warning, the faucet began to rattle, loud, sharp, and violent. We all turned our lights toward it at the same time. The metal pipe was shaking as though something were trapped inside it, as though something were trying to come out. No one moved. For a solid 5 seconds, we stood there in silence, hearts pounding, breath frozen, until one of my friends muttered a curse and bolted. That was the spark. We all turned and ran, back toward the stairs, our footsteps thundering in panic. Adrenaline surged through me like fire. When we burst back into the upper level, we didn't stop. We ran down the hall, barely remembering where we'd come in. Our escape wasn't smooth. We tripped over debris, slammed into walls, and lost our bearings more than once. But eventually we saw light. The window we'd entered through was still open, still waiting. As we climbed out, we heard voices. Security. A man in uniform stopped us. His expression a mix of annoyance and curiosity. He expected trouble, maybe a warning or a call to the police. But after a brief lecture, his tone softened. He asked what we'd seen, and we told him at least part of it. He didn't seem surprised. In fact, he told us something strange. He explained that the building had a reputation. People talked about it, those sounds, the lights, the shadows. He mentioned a teenage boy who had died on the rooftop years ago while tagging a transformer. According to him, strange things had happened ever since. The files we saw earlier, he said, were a source of controversy. They weren't supposed to be there. They were never fully removed. There was always talk about shutting the place down for good, but somehow it just never happened. He looked tired, resigned, and maybe even a little afraid. As he sent us on our way, I remember looking back one last time. The hospital stood quiet again, looming against the night sky, like it had never seen the inside of a flashlight or the fear of trespassers. We never went back. I don't think any of us could. Sometimes we talk about it, wondering if we imagined it all. But none of us ever doubted what we felt, that heavy, invisible presence in the air, the faucet shaking with a force that didn't belong. I still have the photos from that night. Most are blurry, some eerie, one or two capturing what looks like faint mist in places that were otherwise empty, but the real imprint is in my mind. Edgewater Hospital wasn't just abandoned, it was awake, and I don't think it wanted us there. Whatever sleeps inside places like that, it sleeps lightly. And if you're not careful, you might be the next reason someone else comes running back up those stairs in the dark. This story, it was 3 years ago, and I still remember every detail vividly. I was only in 9th grade, just 14 at the time, when our class took a school trip to a city nearly 5 hours from home. We were attending a regional invention contest and exhibition, something held only once every 2 years, and the excitement had been building for months. The hotel we stayed in was modest, 2 floors, not very large, but it was comfortable enough for our small group. What made the place even more convenient was the 7-Eleven right next door, and a short walk beyond that was the school hosting the exhibition. For most of us, this city felt like another world. Coming from a small town, we didn't have things like 24-hour convenience stores, so of course, the novelty of being able to grab snacks late at night became our favorite part of the trip. On the second night of our stay, a small group of us, myself, 2 close friends and 4 other classmates, decided to head to the 7-Eleven around 10 p.m. The streets were quiet by then, most shops already closed, and we were likely the only kids walking around at that hour. Despite our teachers warning us against going out late, our curiosity and excitement overruled caution. When we entered the store, the only person there was a young man working behind the counter, likely in his early 20s. He greeted us with a polite nod, and we dispersed around the aisles. I was scanning the snack shelves when I heard a voice, a deep, masculine voice, coming from the seating area near the windows. That's when I noticed him. A man, possibly in his late 30s or early 40s, was sitting at the table talking to two of my female classmates and a boy from our group. He introduced himself as Bob Leo, claiming to be a musician. To prove it, he began singing off-key lyrics from a Bob Marley song, "No Woman, No Cry." The performance was awkward, forced, and clearly not sincere. Something about him didn't sit right with me. He was large, wore a green shirt and khaki pants, and had a tattoo on his right arm, though I couldn't make out the details. As I stood at a nearby aisle pretending to browse, I kept glancing over, quietly listening. My classmates were being polite but uncomfortable, their body language betraying their unease. I stepped closer, prepared to step in if necessary. Meanwhile, outside the store, two more men were sitting and watching through the glass. Men I hadn't noticed until Bob Leo pointed them out and said they were friends who were going to treat us all to soft serve ice cream. We were stunned and didn't know how to react. The cashier seemed to understand something we didn't. He handed out 3 cones to the group and then quietly leaned toward me. In a whisper, he urged me to leave the store with my classmates as quickly as possible. His voice was calm, but there was urgency behind it. He said he would try to distract the men. I looked around and saw one of our friends, who had gotten closest to the door, trying to leave, only to be stopped by the 2 men outside. They spoke in hushed tones and blocked his path without touching him. I turned back to my group and relayed the cashier's warning. One of the boys quickly acted like he was the boyfriend of one of the girls, taking her hand and leading her away from Bob Leo. Another boy did the same with the second girl. I pulled out my phone, pretending to receive a text from our teacher, saying we needed to return to the hotel. As we started walking out, Bob Leo tried to stall us. He became more assertive, blocking our path and talking faster, as if trying to come up with reasons to keep us there. But we didn't give him the chance. We grabbed our friend who was being spoken to outside and pulled him away. One of the men reached out and briefly grabbed his arm, asking where we were going. He tried to lie, saying they were teachers from the exhibition school, but they couldn't answer any of the basic questions we asked. That's when we knew for sure something was deeply wrong. As we walked away, one of the men muttered something in their native language. Later, a friend translated it for us. It meant, "Damn, we almost got them." My stomach turned. That single sentence said everything. We hurried back to the hotel, shaken and wide-eyed. The girls began to cry, the realization of what had almost happened sinking in. We tried to process it together, comforting each other while also struggling to comprehend how close we had come to something sinister. I later asked the boy, who was stopped outside, what the men had said to him. He brushed it off as nonsense, but I could tell he was still unsettled. That night, none of us slept much. The thought of how that evening could have gone differently haunted us. If the cashier hadn't warned us, if we had stayed a few minutes longer, if we had let our guard down, any one of those things could have changed the ending to our story. The next morning, we told our teachers everything. They were horrified. One of them contacted the local police, but there wasn't much that could be done. We didn't know the names of the men, and we hadn't taken any photos. Without more information, the police could only make a note of the incident. Still, they advised our teachers to keep a closer watch on the group, and from that point forward we weren't allowed to leave the hotel at night. We didn't argue. That near miss had changed all of us. We thanked the cashier before we left town, leaving him a small token of appreciation, though it never felt like enough. He had possibly saved us from something truly horrifying. I still think about him sometimes, and wonder if he ever realized how much that moment meant to us. As for Bob Leo and his 2 silent friends, we never saw them again. I'm grateful for that, but their faces remain etched in my memory. Every now and then, I'll pass someone who vaguely resembles one of them, and a chill will run down my spine. I'll hear that line again in my head, "We almost got them." It makes you realize just how quickly something fun and innocent can turn into a nightmare. We were just kids looking for a late-night snack, and we nearly walked into a trap. That moment taught me to listen to my instincts and to trust the people who try to protect you, even when you don't fully understand the danger yet. We never talked about it much after the trip. It became one of those shared memories that you carry quietly, too heavy to casually bring up, but too important to forget. I know my classmates remember it just as vividly as I do. It was a turning point for us, a reminder that while most people are good, not everyone is. And in moments like those, it only takes one person to speak up, to warn you, to help you see the danger before it's too late. I don't know who Bob Leo really was, or what he intended to do, but I know this: the man behind the register chose to help us, and that choice might have changed everything. $6. I worked the night shift at a motel tucked into the edge of a small city in Oklahoma. It's not a backwoods town. We've got a Walmart, a modest college, and a few chain restaurants that stay open late, but it's small enough that things tend to stay quiet after dark. That was what I liked about the job. I could spend long hours at the front desk, usually with nothing more than the occasional check-in, paperwork, and my laptop to keep me company. It wasn't glamorous, but it gave me time to breathe and let the night pass without much effort. That night, I was settling in as usual, preparing myself for another uneventful shift, when a tall, thin man around 65 walked through the door and changed everything. He introduced himself as the new employee and said he was there for training. I had been told I'd be training someone soon, so I didn't think anything of it. A little disappointed that I wouldn't get to binge watch TV like I'd planned, I waved him behind the desk and began explaining how things worked. At first he seemed pleasant enough. We talked casually, he asked questions, and although he was a bit slow on the uptake, I chalked it up to nerves or age. He told me he'd just gone through a messy divorce, and that this job was part of his attempt to start over. I sympathized. Everyone's carrying something, and I've always tried to treat people kindly, especially when they're vulnerable. But over the next few hours, his behavior began to shift. Subtly at first, then unmistakably. Around 2:30 a.m., he said he'd forgotten his heart medication at home and needed to run and get it. I told him that was fine. He lived about 5 or 10 minutes away, so it didn't seem like a big deal. He left and returned about 30 minutes later. But when he walked back in, something was different. His face was pale, and one of his eyes was only half open, squinting like he was struggling to keep it from closing altogether. I asked if he was okay, and he mumbled something about the medication making him feel strange. Still trying to be helpful, I told him to sit down and take it easy. But then he started acting increasingly erratic. Slouching, freezing mid-sentence, losing focus, staring blankly. I began to get nervous, not for my safety exactly, but because I realized something wasn't right. We tried to watch another episode of Modern Family to pass the time, but his attention wasn't on the screen. That's when he started talking about sex. At first he asked general questions, if I was in a relationship, if I had sex regularly. I gave him vague answers trying to deflect, but he kept pressing. Then he asked flat out if I was gay. Normally I don't hide it, but I was cautious. Still, I admitted I liked men, thinking honesty might shut him down. Instead, it emboldened him. He leaned closer, eyes glassy, and said he liked men too. Then he asked if I wanted to do something. I laughed nervously and told him I couldn't, this was work, and that kind of thing wasn't allowed. But he didn't take the hint. He reached out and touched my thigh. I froze. The touch wasn't violent, but it was invasive, wrong, and made my skin crawl. I pulled away and told him to stop. He backed off for a moment, mumbling an apology. Then, not 2 minutes later, he tried again, this time attempting to be sly, sliding his hand toward me as if I wouldn't notice. I stood up quickly and told him I needed to use the restroom. Instead, I went into the back storage room, locked the door behind me, and called my manager. I explained everything, my voice calm but firm. The manager didn't hesitate. "Call the police," he said. I knew he was right, but even then, part of me still didn't want to believe it had gone that far. I dialed 911 and gave them the details. They said they'd send someone immediately. I returned to the front desk, heart pounding. only to find that the man was no longer there. I checked the first floor, nothing. Then I looked outside. In the dim lighting of the parking lot, I saw a figure on all fours, crawling. It was him. He was weeping, clutching his broken glasses, blood dripping down his face. Apparently he had fallen and hit his head. I didn't know how it happened. Maybe he had passed out or simply stumbled in his confused state. I approached cautiously, helped him up and brought him inside. I cleaned his face with a wet rag and sat him down on the lobby couch. He kept mumbling, asking me for a room, slurring his words and barely staying conscious. He was completely disoriented. I told him I'd get him a room just to keep him calm until help arrived. A few minutes later, the police showed up. They questioned both of us, and after hearing the story, they took him into custody. One officer mentioned they'd dealt with him before, that he had a history of strange behavior, and that this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. It wasn't reassuring, but it was a relief to see him go. When they left, the silence returned to the motel, as if the building itself had exhaled. I sat back down at the desk, my body tense, my mind still reeling. It had all escalated so fast, too fast for me to fully process. The next day, I told my co-workers and family. Their reactions ranged from shock to discomfort. Some were angry, others were scared. But to me, it hadn't felt like a horror story. It had felt more like a tragedy. He wasn't some monster lurking in the shadows. He was a broken man, swallowed up by his demons, trying to find connection in all the wrong ways. That didn't excuse what he did, not even close. But it changed how I looked at the situation. I wasn't physically hurt. I was lucky. But the whole experience opened my eyes to how quickly kindness can be mistaken for invitation, and how boundaries once crossed can leave lasting shadows. Since that night, I've approached my job a little differently. I'm more cautious, more firm, and I trust my gut in ways I never did before. I still work nights and I still enjoy the quiet, but I keep a closer eye on people now, and I've stopped giving strangers the benefit of the doubt when something feels off. Sometimes it's not just a quirky guest or a lonely man. Sometimes it's someone teetering on the edge of something darker, and sometimes you are the only person there to hold the line between what's safe and what isn't. That night taught me a lot about trust, about instinct, and about the quiet strength it takes to say no when someone else refuses to hear it. Seventh story. It was during one of those long, aimless summers when my cousin and I discovered something strange in the woods behind our neighborhood. We were young, curious, and bored, the kind of combination that always leads to unexpected finds. Our favorite pastime was exploring the trails that wound through the forest where new houses were being built, fresh developments creeping into the wild. One afternoon we were walking the path that followed the edge of the construction zone when we spotted it. A small wooden cross sticking up from the ground. It wasn't elaborate, just two weathered planks bound together with a strip of cloth, leaning slightly as if time had already begun to pull it down. We stared at it in silence. My cousin said it was probably just something a kid had made, a game or prank, but something about it felt different, older, more deliberate. For a moment, we stood there, unsure of what to say. Then, trying to shake off the unease, we continued on, chalking it up to coincidence. The construction had been slow in that part of the woods, but eventually, workers came in with bulldozers and equipment. The cross vanished. They cleared the trees and flattened the earth, and soon the skeletons of new homes began to rise. Nothing unusual was reported. No bones, no evidence of anything beneath the dirt, and for a time, we forgot all about it. But one day, curiosity got the better of us. We waited until the crews left for the evening and decided to sneak into one of the partially built homes. We had never been inside during construction, and something about the raw frame of a house made it feel like a playground built for ghosts. We weren't supposed to be there, of course. Our parents had warned us, and the signs were clear. Keep out. Authorized personnel only. But kids rarely listen. The house was still in its early stages, just beams and plywood, no drywall or electricity. We stepped over piles of debris and ducked beneath low-hanging boards. Inside it was strangely quiet, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows through the open framework. For the first few minutes we wandered through the rooms, poking around, laughing, trying to guess what each room would become. Then we stopped. In the middle of one of the rooms was a scorched patch on the floor, black and jagged, surrounded by charred wood. It looked as though something had burned there, but the rest of the house was untouched. We crouched down, studying the burn mark. There were no tools nearby, no discarded cigarettes. It didn't look like a construction accident, and more than that, the air felt wrong, thick, heavy, like a warning. We left quickly, not saying much as we walked back through the woods. The next day, the news broke. A house at the edge of the construction site had burned to the ground in the middle of the night. No one was injured, thankfully. It had still been unoccupied. The fire department arrived quickly, but the structure was a total loss. My cousin and I recognized the location immediately. It was the same house we'd explored the night before, the same one with the scorch mark on the floor. We said nothing, not even to each other. That silence stretched between us, a quiet agreement never to bring it up again. Then a week later, another house burned. This one was farther into the development, just 2 houses away from the previous one. Again, it was unoccupied. Again, there was no clear cause. The neighborhood buzzed with rumors. Some said it was faulty wiring. Others whispered about angry spirits or cursed land. Eventually, the police arrested a man, an arsonist who had been protesting the destruction of the forest. He claimed that nature was striking back, that the homes were being built where they didn't belong. He said he was just helping nature finish the job, but something about that explanation didn't sit right with me. The fires had a pattern. They started from the ground, from places that looked exactly like that burn we had seen, places that felt wrong. Years have passed since then, but that summer stays with me. I often wonder about the cross we found, the one that disappeared when construction began. Who put it there? What did it mark? Sometimes I think it was a grave, not a traditional one, but a symbolic marker. Maybe it was placed to warn people, to keep something buried. And when they tore it down, they broke whatever barrier had been holding that darkness in place. The arsonist was convicted, but I don't believe he was acting alone, not in spirit. I think something deeper than him was at work, something old, patient, and angry. That first house, the one we explored, had been the trigger. Maybe it wasn't coincidence that we stepped into it right before it burned. Sometimes, at night, when the wind howls through the trees, I think I hear it, the crackle of flames, the whisper of something shifting in the soil. I haven't gone back to that part of the forest. The houses were rebuilt, sold, and now families live there, unaware of what happened before them. They host barbecues and birthday parties, laughing in backyards where ashes once fell. But I can't forget. My cousin doesn't talk about it anymore, but I know he remembers too. We share that kind of silence that doesn't fade, that memory you carry like a pebble in your shoe. It doesn't hurt all the time, but every now and then, it reminds you of where you've been. Looking back, I wonder if we should have done something more, told someone what we saw, spoken up about the cross, the burn mark, the feeling. But we were just kids. Who would have believed us? Even now I can barely believe it myself. All I know is that there was something unnatural about that place, something that didn't want to be disturbed. And when the builders came, when they dug into the soil and erased the trees, they stirred something that had been at rest. Some spirits, I think, are not meant to be disturbed. Some warnings are not meant to be ignored. And some places, no matter how shiny the new homes may be, still remember what was there before. I still live nearby, though I no longer walk those trails. The development has grown, swallowing more of the woods every year. They keep building, keep selling, keep pretending that land is just dirt and trees. But I know better. I saw what happened when we forgot to respect what came before. I don't need to see flames to feel the heat anymore. It lives in my memory, a smouldering ember that never quite dies. And sometimes, in the middle of the night, I dream of a small wooden cross standing alone in the clearing, waiting. 8th story. I've been a nurse for over a decade now, and in that time, death has become a quiet part of my everyday life. Working in an elder care facility, you grow accustomed to the gentle coming and going of souls. It's never easy, but over the years I learned how to be present without fear, how to sit with the dying without sadness, and how to carry their memory with grace. After spending years in a fast-paced hospital setting, I switched to night shifts in our residential care unit. The slower pace gave me time to think, and I welcomed the quiet of the evenings. Most nights were uneventful. Routine check-ins, medication rounds, the occasional soft conversation with a restless resident. I never feared the dark, and I never believed in anything supernatural. Until last summer, when one death changed everything I thought I knew about this job. His name was Mr. F, a former resident who'd long outstayed the staff's patience. He was cruel to his wife, also once a resident, and we eventually had to separate them. He would yell, belittle her, and even kick at their dog until we intervened and found the animal a better home. When Mr. F died, I can't say anyone mourned him. There were no tears, no prayers whispered through the halls. If anything, there was a quiet relief. That evening, I was working with a colleague I didn't particularly enjoy. She was the kind who made excuses to disappear during her shift. I didn't mind being alone. In fact, I preferred it. I found a quiet spot on one of the upper floors and began watching YouTube on my tablet, trying to make the hours pass a little faster. That's when it started, the feeling that something was behind me. At first, it was just a sensation, a faint chill on the back of my neck, the kind of feeling you might get if someone walked past you silently. But when I turned, no one was there. I brushed it off, blaming my tired eyes or the silence playing tricks on me. But then came the sound, an abrupt metallic crash from the hallway behind me. I jumped. When I turned the corner, I found one of the large laundry carts tipped over. Its contents spilled across the floor. The wheel was still spinning. Those carts were heavy, sturdy, not the kind to topple over without someone pushing them. Something about the scene sent a jolt through my chest. I picked it up quickly, tried to calm myself, and convinced myself it must have been an accident. Maybe someone had nudged it earlier and it had just now fallen. But deep down, I didn't believe that. After that, I rejoined my colleague. I didn't want to be alone anymore. The rest of the night started out quiet again, though there was a noticeable tension in the air. People seemed jittery. One of my co-workers, usually cold and aloof, suddenly clung to me like a nervous child. Something was off. She seemed reluctant to be alone, and that struck me as strange. As the night wore on, the silence became punctuated by sounds that didn't belong, a series of gentle knocks, like someone rapping their knuckles softly against the wall. It wasn't loud enough to cause alarm, but it was persistent, coming from different directions, moving around the building, almost like it was trying to lure us. We told ourselves it was nothing. Rats, maybe, the wind, old pipes. But we didn't believe it. Not really. We began to check the floors, hoping that if we walked toward the sound, we'd find its source. But no matter where we went, the noise moved ahead of us. We'd hear it in the east wing, walk toward it, then suddenly it would echo from the west. It was like chasing a shadow. At one point, a resident flagged us down, frightened. He said there was a little man in his room, staring at him from the corner. We knew he had dementia and often had vivid dreams, but he wasn't one of the usual cases. He'd never said anything like that before. We entered the room and of course it was empty, but he wouldn't calm down. He kept pointing, insisting that someone had been there. An hour later, 2 more residents called us for the same reason. By then, fear had settled in our bones. We grabbed a kitchen knife, more symbolic than useful, and carried it with us as we made our rounds. Then, around 1 a.m., the sound changed. We no longer heard taps or knocks, we heard footsteps. Heavy, fast, purposeful footsteps racing down the hallways. At first, we thought someone was running, but when we searched, we found no one. The steps grew louder, closer, until we could feel them in our chests like thunder. Lights flickered. Doors that had been shut were suddenly open. We turned them off, only to find them back on again. It was as if someone was actively working against us, walking just ahead or just behind, always unseen. My colleague, usually stoic, began crying. I tried to keep my voice steady, but I was trembling. At one point, we passed a room that had been locked earlier. It was now wide open. Inside, the air was freezing. We checked the thermostat, nothing unusual. And yet, our breath came out in clouds. We left without saying a word. At sunrise, we sat in silence, waiting for the morning shift to arrive. When they did, we told them everything. No one laughed. In fact, they had experienced similar things the night before. None of them wanted to come back for the next shift. That afternoon, our boss arranged for a spiritual counselor to visit the facility. He was someone the residents trusted, a hospital volunteer who claimed to have a gift for speaking to souls in transition. He and my colleague entered Mr. F's former room. They stayed for over an hour. She wouldn't speak about what happened inside, but when they left, the building felt different. That night, nothing happened, and the next, and the next. Whatever darkness had been walking our halls had passed, but the memory of it lingers like smoke after a fire. Since then, 2 more residents have passed while I was on shift, and though I remain calm, doing my best, there's always a quiet fear in the back of my mind, a flicker in the corner of my eye, a breath that isn't mine. I don't believe Mr. F came back for vengeance. I think he never left. He died with bitterness in his bones, and for a time that bitterness filled the walls like mold. Some spirits move on gently, others need to be shown the way, and some resist the end entirely, clinging to the halls they once cursed. I hope whatever came through that night found its peace. I hope it never happens again, but if it does, I'll be ready. The night story. My family used to own a small, quiet cabin nestled deep in the mountains of Colorado. It sat at the base of a snow-covered valley that looked like it had been untouched for generations. My father inherited it from his grandfather, who had built it by hand back in the 1940s. The place had always felt like a time capsule. Wooden beams stained with age, a fireplace that crackled warmly, and an antique radio that still worked when you turned the dial just right. We didn't visit often, just during winter breaks or the occasional holiday, but whenever we did, it felt like stepping into a simpler world. The snow would fall thick and slow, muffling all sound, making the entire valley feel like it existed in a bubble outside of time. That silence used to comfort me, until one night, it didn't. It was the winter of my 16th birthday, and my parents had driven up early to prep the cabin while I stayed behind to finish a school project. I planned to take the train up and meet them a few days later, but a heavy snowstorm was rolling in, and by the time I arrived at the mountain station, the road up to the cabin had already been closed to most vehicles. I wasn't too worried. My dad had given me a snowmobile, and I was pretty good at handling it. I set off up the trail, bundled in layers, my backpack strapped tightly to the seat behind me. The snow was already thick, blanketing the ground in uneven mounds. The trees lining the trail stood like silent sentinels, weighed down by fresh powder, unmoving. I kept my eyes on the trail and rode in silence. The only sound the drone of the engine. It took me nearly 45 minutes to reach the clearing where our cabin stood, but as soon as I arrived I could tell something was wrong. There were no lights, no smoke from the chimney, no tire tracks or footprints leading to or from the cabin. The windows were completely dark. I parked the snowmobile and stood still for a long moment staring. My breath clouded the air, and the cold bit through my gloves. I told myself maybe my parents had gone into town or had trouble getting the generator running, but deep down, I felt something heavy settle in my stomach. I walked to the door and knocked, then called out. No answer. I tried the knob, but it was locked. I found the spare key hidden beneath the porch steps and let myself in. The air inside was colder than it should have been, and everything was still, too still. Their bags were there, their jackets hanging on the hooks by the door. The kettle sat on the stove, untouched, with a film of frost on the rim. The fireplace hadn't been used. I walked from room to room, calling their names, but the cabin was empty. There were no signs of a struggle, no notes, no trail of footsteps outside. I checked the woodshed, the tool shack, even the small outhouse behind the cabin. Nothing. It was as if they had vanished into the snow. That first night I huddled in the main room, trying to keep the fire lit and telling myself they'd return in the morning. But they didn't. And as the night wore on, I began to hear things. The wind, at first sharp and howling, then the creak of wood, as if the beams above me were groaning under an unseen weight. But then came the tapping. It started faintly, like tiny fingers against glass. At first, I thought it was ice falling from the roof, but then it moved, from one window to the next, circling the cabin. I stayed by the fire, frozen, listening. Then I saw the shape, just outside the front window, barely visible in the dark. A figure, tall and still, wrapped in something dark and heavy. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its gaze. It didn't move, just stood there, watching. I blinked, and it was gone. I checked the door, it was locked. I checked the window, nothing. No footprints in the snow. I thought I had imagined it. I told myself I had. But when I finally fell asleep, curled up on the couch, I dreamed of my parents standing in the woods, motionless, their mouths open in silent screams. In the morning, I woke to find the fire dead and the door cracked open. Snow had drifted in, and my boot prints were the only ones on the floor. I bolted the door and stayed inside the rest of the day, trying to reach someone on the emergency radio. Nothing but static. I turned on every light I could. As the sun began to set again, I saw it once more, this time farther away, at the edge of the tree line, the same tall shape, cloaked in snow and shadows. It didn't move. It just watched. I kept the fire going all night, clutching a fireplace poker like it could protect me. The tapping returned around midnight, soft and rhythmic, like a heartbeat on the glass. I didn't sleep. On the third day, the wind died down, and I made the decision to leave. I packed what I could, started the snowmobile, and rode until I reached a ranger station about 20 miles down the trail. I burst in, shivering and incoherent. They took me in, gave me hot food, blankets, and then called the authorities. A search party was organized. They found the cabin just as I had left it. My parents' belongings inside. No signs of a struggle, no footprints, no trail, nothing. It was like they had stepped out into the snow and disappeared. A missing persons case was filed, but no leads ever surfaced. Over the years, the story faded into silence. But I never forgot. I still dream of that figure in the snow. I've drawn it countless times, sketched the folds of its coat, the place where its eyes should have been. Always the same shape, always silent. I've read stories since then, legends about spirits in the mountains, beings that wait for the lost or the weak. They don't chase you, they don't scream. They simply stand, patient and cold, waiting for you to see them. Once you do, they never leave. I believe something ancient lives in those woods, something that doesn't obey our understanding of time or reason. I believe it took my parents. I don't know why, and I don't think I ever will. But I've never returned to that cabin. I never will. And sometimes, even in my city apartment, I wake in the middle of the night and swear I hear tapping on the window. Even when it hasn't snowed in weeks, even when I live on the 4th floor,